Well, hello everybody. We are going to get started here. And so welcome again to another webinar. We're very excited to be doing this webinar today. Tanse Gamamak Nitsigasan, Mackenzie Brown Nitsigasan, Pigitoachkanska Higan, Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, Ochinia. So my name is Mackenzie Brown and I am the project manager with Indigenous Tourism Alberta. And I'm really excited to do this webinar because this webinar it's on a topic that I believe is so important. It is called Creating Meaningful Relationships, but then I changed the name to Building Reciprocal Relationships. So we're going to be talking about both building those meaningful relationships, but then also it's really important that when we're creating relationships that they're reciprocal as well. This particular topic is important to me and important to the Indigenous tourism industry because we are not going to become successful unless we have those partnerships. We just recently were able to do two indoor summits, in-person summits. One was at the Grey Eagle Resort and Casino and one was at Métis Crossing in the Smoky Lake region. And during a panel, we talked about the importance of partnerships, the importance of relationships, and every single entrepreneur that has been successful in the Indigenous tourism industry has spoke to the importance of having good partnerships, good relationships. There are a lot of challenges for Indigenous tourism operators and business owners, and Lisa Lima from Travel Alberta once told me, do what you do best and partner for the rest. So we're going to go through how we can create relationships with one another, both from an Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship, and then also just in general, how we can create reciprocal relationships with one another and partnerships to move together and to really develop something that is unique and important. And so here we go. So the first thing that I wanted to chat with you guys about is why is it important? Why is it important to work with one another? Why is it important for non-Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities to work together? Just why is this an important thing to do? So when we look at relationships and partnerships, what they really do is they create a stronger, united voice for engaging business and other levels of government. When we have more people in the room fighting for a certain project, engaging, and there's more leverage to it. It gives you a stronger voice. It gives you a little bit more push in terms of getting funding, in terms of getting support from government. So it creates that stronger, united voice. I had just touched on this, but it also increases the ability to access funding from other levels of government. Government's always looking at how many partnerships do you have, how many relationships, who is supportive of this particular project. So when you have those relationships with one another, it will be easier for you to access funding from the government because you can show that you have support. Creates a stronger regional identity, relationships, and sense of place. So something that I like talking about when we look at stronger regional identity is the partnership right now that Métis Crossing, one of our members, has with the Smoky Lake municipality and the town of Smoky Lake. They're working together, and together they can create this regional identity, because they have all of these they have Métis Crossing, they're working on getting accommodation, they're working, they have their great pumpkin festival, they have National Indigenous Peoples Day, and it creates this really strong identity for the Smoky Lake region. We see this happening in other pockets of Alberta. We see when Edmonton works all together, you get that Edmonton all in Calgary, you get that strong regional identity. When we look at the Calgary Stampede, right? You go down there and everything is in the Stampede, and that creates a huge identity for the city. It's also cost saving when providing services, due to higher efficiencies and less duplication. So you can pool your resources and you can do some cost saving. And then there's more opportunity for local development and jobs. If you can create jobs for different partners, that's always a really great thing. So this is why it's important to work together. I could continue on with this chat about why it's important, but these are some kind of highlights on why it's important to create industry partners, to create relationships with one another in the Indigenous tourism industry. I have more for you. So we also can look at the ability to leverage the unique financial, human, and physical capabilities and capacities of each partner. So again, as I had mentioned, do what you do best, partner for the rest. What can somebody else do really well that you can't do? Then what can you do for them in return? It's coordinated planning efforts to improve land use and land management as well. And then also you can create coordinated planning efforts to aid in protecting resources and natural environments that are important. So now we're going to get into a bit of the meat and potatoes about creating relationships with one another. So for this portion of the webinar, I'm kind of coming from if you are non-Indigenous and want to create relationships with Indigenous partners. And this starts with awareness. Awareness is incredibly important. You want to make sure that you understand who you want to create a relationship with, and that you have a baseline understanding of maybe what nation that person is from, what community protocols are in place, and so that you can work together to create partnership. And this also works for Indigenous to non-Indigenous partnerships too. You want to be aware of, okay, do you want to create a relationship with a destination marketing organization? Would it make more sense for you to be in touch with meetings and conventions team or travel trade team or the development teams or the marketing teams? So having that awareness as well. I always suggest for people to create a partner drawing on, okay, this is what I want to accomplish. Who can help me get there? And then how can we create that reciprocal relationship with one another? So start creating a bit of a diagram. And if it's a destination marketing organization that you want to create a relationship with, if it is Travel Alberta, if it is, maybe you want to start doing tours on a certain plot of land, creating that relationship as well. So it all begins with awareness. So I'm going to come from an Indigenous perspective for a little while. So if you are non-Indigenous and you want to create a relationship with an Indigenous operator, or if you're Indigenous and you want to create a relationship with an Indigenous operator in an Indigenous community, I give you this treaty map. So this treaty map was created by the Alberta Teachers Association, and it's called Walking Together or Stepping Stones. They have a ton of amazing resources on the Indigenous people of Alberta, so I highly recommend looking that up. So if you just Google Walking Together Treaty Map, Teachers Association of Alberta, this will pop up. Now you can see all 5 treaties in Alberta. So the main treaties that we have in Alberta, Treaty 8, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and then Treaty 4 and Treaty 10 come in just a little bit. So you can see that to the right side of Alberta, bordering along Saskatchewan. This is also really great because it shows you the Métis regions, it shows you the Métis settlements, as well as the different nations that we have. You can also find a map that shows you the different reserves that we have, because each nation has a handful of different reserves as well. But this gives you an overall idea. So let's say you live in Edmonton and you're thinking, okay, I really want to start creating relationships with the Indigenous communities surrounding Edmonton, let's say in a 100-kilometer radius. So you can take a look and you can see, okay, well, it would be really good for me to engage with the Papas Chase First Nations, Michelle First Nations, probably Enoch Cree Nation, Ermineskin's pretty close, Saddle Lake's getting a little bit further out, Alexander's really close, same with Paul First Nations. So that's when you can start taking a look at who is surrounding you and your city and who can you start creating those relationships with. Something else that I really like about this map is it shows you what nation each tribe is, what tribe each nation is from. So you can see we have quite a few Cree. Cree is the circle. If you download the proper map, it comes with the legend as well. You can see we have some Dene, we have some Stony, we have Blackfoot, and we have some Beaver as well, which is very, very similar to Dene. So this gives you a good understanding of, okay, maybe I need to do a little bit of research into what are Cree protocols if I want to engage with the Cree community. What are some Dene protocols if I want to, you know, have a conversation with maybe Sutina, the Beaver people. What are some Blackfoot protocols? This gives you a really good baseline for starting research. And then you can also look at if you're ever going to a nation and let's say you want to do a treaty acknowledgement, it's really good to acknowledge the nation that you're on and then the treaty. So you can see we have right here is Treaty 6. We have Treaty 7 down in the south, Treaty 8 up north of Alberta. So then again, I just like to show you this map. Then you can also see, again, the Métis settlements surrounding as well. Perfect. So that's always my first thing, awareness. If you want to create relationships with somebody, just be aware what tribe they're from, what are some initial protocols in place. If you are Indigenous wanting to work with non-Indigenous, what kind of partners should you be reaching out to? Always start with a little bit of research first. So now I'm going to get into kind of 4 steps for creating relationships with one another. I love this resource. It's one of my favorite resources of all time. It's called the CEDA, and that stands for the Community Economic Development, CEDI, the Community Economic Development Initiative, and it's from CANDO, and CANDO is the Indigenous Economic Development Corporation of Canada. And they created this joint First Nations and municipality community economic development planning process. And while this particular resource deals with economic development, which again is tourism, it also just touches on some really key parts of relationship building that people can take into every relationship that they want to create with somebody, whether they're Indigenous, non-Indigenous, everything in between. So this resource talks about 4 different parts to relationship building. You start in connection, you move to vision, you move to deciding, and then you move to acting. So I'm going to take you guys through these 4 different steps. Something that I like to show is I like this diagram because you can see the 4 different parts of creating relationship with one another, but then you can see that it takes a while. It takes a while. I think that that's really important to understand. I think sometimes the industry of tourism, because it is very business focused, it can be very quick and try to be very quick. But you have to understand that, especially when working with Indigenous communities or Indigenous entrepreneurs, that is a process that will take a while. and that it is okay that it takes a while. You know, historically, we have seen that there has not been trust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and Indigenous relationships. And so this idea of creating relationship with one another takes a while, but it is important to go through all of the steps. You don't want to push the cart before you push the horse, right? So the first step to relationship building and meaningful partnerships and reciprocal relationships in any culture is connection. Connection. You need to connect with one another. So this is when you look at relationship building. You look at sharing history with one another, sharing culture, sharing governance. That's really important because political structures can be very different for different organizations, and it's important to understand the governance of two different organizations to know that you know what the processes are, what the policies are, how you can then create maybe a joint governance structure in working together. And then this is also, you know, eventually when you decide if you will work together, is in this connection stage. So I always tell people that focus on building that relationship, but then also be upfront with what your intentions are and making sure that everybody is on the same page with intentions. That's really important when you look at creating relationship with one another. So for my non-Indigenous friends that are watching this webinar, I wanted to give you some tips on engaging with Indigenous peoples. This is really good. I give you guys quite a bit of tips. I won't necessarily go through all of them. This webinar will be on YouTube afterwards, so you can watch it. You can rewatch it and put down all of the tips. But it's funny because I say that these are tips for engaging with Indigenous people, but really they're also tips for just engaging with people in general. I think there's a lot of key pieces of advice in this that can definitely go across different cultures. Okay. So the first tip for you is remember the importance of face-to-face interactions. I know that this is a tough one with COVID right now, but traditionally when you're working with Indigenous communities, face-to-face interactions and showing up to things are really important. Making sure that you have an actual invested interest, you know, go over to celebrations that various nations are having, show up to events that Indigenous entrepreneurs are putting on, show up, have those face-to-face interactions with one another. Establish relationships with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples before you need something. This is really important. And I think that this again goes for all different people. We want to have a relationship before we feel like we need to give something to somebody. It's just a respect thing. And when you're working with Indigenous peoples, relationships is the most important thing. Always create that relationship first. Remembering names and remembering protocol, that's a really big thing. We'll chat a little bit about protocol later, but an important tip. And then this comes into that awareness piece that I was talking about before. Research the community and the governing parties before you go into that community. It's really important to have a base understanding, so that, let's say you want to go in and you would really like to greet that nation in their own language. Make sure that you know what that language is. We've seen this happen before, and it means a lot when you're able to research that community first. This is a big one. Recognize the importance that individual nations highly value their autonomy. Not all nations speak for one another, and don't set up situations where that is the case. So we have a couple of different nations. When we look at Musqueam or Stoney Nakoda, both of those are split up into a couple different nations. So for Musqueam, there is there's the Montana, Louisville, Sampson, and then we have another one. And then for Stoney Nakota Nation, we have Chiniki, we have Bears Paw, we have Wesley. So when you're deciding to work with a nation, know that you can't go and speak to the Chiniki Nation and assume that they're also speaking in reference to Bears Paw Nation. That's not the case at all. Make sure that that if you're going to one of those nations that is split, that you're engaging all of those different chiefs, all of those different CEOs, all of those different councils. And again, you can look back at that map that I provided at the beginning to see if that is the case, and do your research. Again, if you're working with two nations, contact both of them. Doing your due diligence to learn about and follow community protocol and or best practices. So protocol, it is a tough thing to chat about just because protocol changes. Because we are not a homogenous people. We have very different protocol across different nations. But typically, if you are working with an Indigenous person and you are asking for some kind of traditional knowledge, that is when it is appropriate to offer tobacco. I've heard that there are some Métis people who will take tobacco. There are some Métis people who prefer tea. It is something that you can always ask. You can always ask before a meeting, say, hey, before this meeting, could I just ask for a little bit of guidance in terms of protocol? Should I be bringing tobacco to offer to you prior to this meeting? Most people will be happy to tell you and to let you know. So remember following community protocol and to ask. This is a good one. There are many ceremonial activities that Indigenous communities partake in. Be aware of when that Indigenous community may be having an event and don't schedule meetings around that time. For example, funerals. Funerals are if there's a funeral in a community, usually that community shuts down. So I've had it before where I've had a meeting scheduled and there's been a funeral and we've just had to postpone that meeting and choose another time because that's really important for the community to be there. Hunting, another thing, we are literally getting into hunting season right now. So when I've been working with communities in terms of setting up some workshops, we've had to push them back a little bit later or start them right now. And that's just something that we are aware of because we won't get the participants that we want because it's important that they have that time to go out, hunt, fish, do ceremony. Recognize and respect First Nations personal and cultural activities. Learning the proper pronunciation of words. If you're unsure, please ask. It means a lot to Indigenous communities when you try to use a bit of their language, even if it's just a greeting. But make sure that you know the proper pronunciation of the words. You can either reach out to Indigenous Tourism Alberta, reach out to a language keeper that you know, or there's a ton of language resources online, and most of them have the phonetic spelling, or you can listen to a little audio tape that will help take you through that. Determine who the appropriate community contacts are, and then when you're starting a project, make sure that they're kept informed, not just at the beginning when you need to have them on side. So this is a good one. How do you determine who the appropriate community contacts are? This, I cannot give you a straight answer because sometimes you can go onto a nation's website and just call the band office and they'll put you in touch with them. Sometimes it is a bit more of a hide and seek game in the sense that you call, somebody forwards you onto another person, you call them, they forward you onto another person, and then eventually you make it down. But don't be afraid to just reach out to a community and say, hey, this is what I have this is the project that I am interested in doing. I was wondering if you could point me in the right direction of who I should be talking to. And this will also become easier when you have a relationship with that community or that person as well. It is much easier to get contact information once you have an established relationship. Arrange those personal meetings. Again, we talked about first face-to-face. First Nations rights are communally held, and this may slow down the decision-making process. We've seen this a lot. Sometimes certain deadlines have to be pushed because it's not just one person making a decision. It has to go to chief and council. Maybe sometimes it has to go to the powwow committee. It has to go to another committee. Just understand that, and that will take a long time, and that yes, it can be easy to get frustrated sometimes with the timing that it's taking, but that's very important to Indigenous communities. And then I should have changed the wording of this to do not think of or refer to Indigenous people as stakeholders. Just refer to them as partners. You know, I just like to put that in there. And then Indigenous peoples may identify themselves in a variety of ways. Again, this will become apparent once you have a relationship with that person. You will know then if what terms they would prefer you to use, but always use that baseline term of Indigenous when working with Indigenous people. Use plain language. We are in an industry full of acronyms. Am I right? We have acronyms for everything. We have acronyms for acronyms. Just use plain language. You don't need to get into those funky government terms. And if you're creating an MOU, let's say with a nation, and you need to have those funky terms, have a translator, somebody to just explain what these big acronyms and these big words mean. Just using plain language. Always make sure to thank, if you're going to a community, always make sure to thank the community for the invitation into their traditional territory, and then that's when you can do land acknowledgement. Also, expect to participate in cultural events. Don't be afraid to ask for protocol from the host. We see a lot of Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, when they are starting a partnership with somebody, they like to do ceremony with them. So be aware that this could be a possibility, and don't be afraid to ask for protocol guidance. This is one that a lot of people have focused on, but I don't think it depends on the person again. It is customary that in our teachings as Indigenous people that direct eye contact is disrespectful, and to show people respect that we avert our eyes. So just be aware of that. Sometimes there are just Indigenous tribes, Indigenous people that just don't make direct eye contact, and it's not just respectful, it's actually out of respect. And sometimes we do shake hands, sometimes we don't. During COVID, we should not be shaking hands at all. So that's just another thing. Recognize the intergenerational impact of the residential schools and link to substance abuse. This is really important when you're working with Indigenous peoples. Whether somebody has been impacted, it's always a little bit prevalent, and so that's why it's so important to create relationships with one another. You never know where somebody's coming from, and that's for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. You don't have to overdress. You can dress down. Sometimes that's even better, especially if you're going on nation. Of course, dress respectfully, but you don't have to show up in a suit. It's okay. And then this is a really great one. Keep a buffer time between the end of a meeting with an Indigenous community or an entrepreneur before the next appointment. Always give the respect that things take time. We have this stereotype that Indigenous people are always late, or that we take up a lot of time, which one is a stereotype and not necessarily true. But I also acknowledge that we believe that important things take time. And in a relationship, keep that time. Give us that time. Give that relationship that time. Give even more. Always communicate. This is for everybody. If you're in a project with one another, always communicate about it. How's the project going? How's the progress? What are your challenges? You know, it's also always good that if you have more than a couple people at a meeting, have name tags in the roles. Honor all agreements, especially oral agreements, and we've seen this happen. Not necessarily the best in history, right? That oral agreements are really important to Indigenous people. And if that means that you guys record your meetings so that you're able to get everything on the meeting minutes, you can do that with the consent of everybody. And then, oh, I did this one again because it's important. Provide transparent information. And then another good thing is learn to stay up to date on First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit issues. That's really important to us. So that's all in connection. We're not even at vision, deciding, or acting. And that's because connecting and building relationship is the foundation. It is so important. So there are some tips for you, you know, just remember to give that connection that time of day. Don't jump into projects right away. Get to know one another, form that relationship, form what that partnership can look like. All right, now we're getting into vision. So once you've connected, you've decided that you want to work together, you're getting to know one another a little bit. This is when you create a shared vision for the relationship and you can formally commit to that relationship. So this is when we see people start thinking about, okay, what are some projects that we want to work on? What can that look like? We're not even acting yet. We're just thinking, we're just brainstorming and envisioning. And then this is also when you see MOUs come into place, modern day treaties coming into place. So this is when you can commit in whatever way makes sense to you and that partnership. After you do those visions, then that's when you can decide. So you can decide on joint initiatives. You can start developing work plans, start developing if you need to create a new governance structure for your partnership with one another. This is when you start deciding on those kind of things. And again, if we take a look here, we can see that visioning also takes a couple months. Same with deciding. And then we get to acting. And then that's when we can work together and implement the work plans. But all of this stuff comes before. And it's really important that you take that time to connect, to vision, to decide, and then to act afterwards. So that's kind of four steps to follow when creating relationships with one another. And this then, all of this, in order to accomplish this, it requires a shift in thinking. So it requires a shift in thinking from coexisting to partnering. You know, a shift from thinking us and them and then thinking we are in this together. So we see a lot of communities right now, and a lot of cities or municipalities working with the Indigenous communities surrounding, because now it's not just that we're coexisting beside one another, but we are in this together. So let's work together. Mm-hmm. It's when it shifts from informal to formal. This is important in terms of business side of things, that it's important to create a formal relationship with one another. So that's when you can put in an MOU, a modern day treaty, some kind of agreement in place that you're just formally committing to working in relationship with one another. I love this one. It goes from competition to collaboration. We see this a lot when you look at Indigenous communities or Indigenous tourism endeavors working together. We don't see a ton of competition in terms of Indigenous tourism across Alberta because everybody knows that we're in this together and that we are all unique and that we all bring something different to the table. So make sure to focus on that as well. You can move from competition to collaboration. You know, creating those stronger regions, creating those partnerships, driving business to two businesses instead of one, right? If you create like a joint experience partnership, that's always really cool. And then you move from reactive to proactive. So you shift in waiting for action from levels of government, from another person, to implementing and advocating for local solutions. And then you move from short term to long term. Always know that when you're in a relationship with somebody, it's usually for the long term, and that's really fantastic. All right. So now we've reached the time for questions, and so I'll just look at my Q&A box to see if I have any questions. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, please note that you can see this webinar online at indigenoustourismalberta.ca. We have a ton of other resources. If you haven't watched the other webinars and you want to see more of me, you can do that on our website. You can check out our resources. We have a ton of other resources as well. And if you ever need to get a hold of us, you can get a hold of us at info@indigenoustourismalberta.ca. So I'd like to thank everybody again for attending our webinar today, and I hope that you have a new understanding of what can come from relationship building, how to create relationships, and yeah, start creating a little bit of a document on who you want to be in relationship with, what you need to know about that, and start creating those amazing partnerships that we see happen in Indigenous tourism and across Alberta. So take care. I will be back next week, and I hope everybody has a fantastic day.